a scientist interested in the environmental setting of coastal cities, I am particularly interested in the way New Orleans is framed as exceptional environmentally in terms of its physical location, location below sea level and in a dynamic floodplain, and exceptional in its vulnerability to hurricanes and natural disasters. I've encountered many people, from ordinary citizens to scientists and engineers to social scientists to scholars of public policy, who regard New Orleans as a city with a rich past but no future, a city that is fated to undergo another huge disaster sooner or later, recovery from which may be impossible and will certainly be an economic burden to the nation and society. There is, in this analysis, an underlying belief that New Orleans' exceptional vulnerability makes it beyond rescue, or perhaps not worth the effort of trying. An implicit part of this argument is that other cities on the coast are not as vulnerable as New Orleans, and therefore not as problematic. It would be incorrect to deny that New Orleans is in a highly vulnerable location, not only in terms of the current risk from hurricanes, but also in terms of the potential and unavoidable effects of climate change, such as sea level rise. However, I submit that New Orleans is merely the first US example of a problem that will be faced by every coastal city in the United States in our lifetime: the future effects of climate change on our coasts, and especially our urban centers on the coast. No coastal urban center globally will be immune to the effects of climate change, and that's what a lot of people in my field think right now. Therefore, another way to frame the quote-unquote exceptional environmental vulnerability of New Orleans is as a harbinger of what is yet to come, and some would argue is already happening in cities like Miami, Houston, San Francisco, Boston, and New York. In this framing of New Orleans, instead of New Orleans being so special as to not be worth our resources, I would argue that New Orleans is an important arena currently where issues that every coastal city globally must grapple with in the future are being played out. Societies across the globe currently face the necessity of what people in my field call adapting to climate change and its accompanying challenges to environmental, social, and economic resiliency. New Orleans post-Katrina faces the well-publicized suite of issues in Southeast Louisiana that include reliable flood control technology, wetland loss and coastal degradation, the presence of economically important industry, and the threatened livelihood and future of an economically vulnerable but vibrant and historically significant culture. My first major point is thus that New Orleans is a significant case study of the way science and engineering, public policy, and social structures are intertwined. Addressing these dynamics in New Orleans with new interdisciplinary approaches and new channels of communication between scientists, citizens, and a word I hate, other stakeholders, will not only positively impact the recovery and future resiliency of an important United States city, but will also serve as a model for other communities facing similar challenges worldwide. The second theme I want to address here is that the environmental and thus scientific and technological challenges we face today globally are serving to remake the way scientific research is carried out, and are also serving to problematize the relationship between scientists and other quote-unquote experts and the communities in which they work. From fisheries management to forest policy to endangered species conservation, the perspective of scientists has historically often been at odds with local communities whose economic livelihood, survival, and culture are dependent on and are inextricably linked with the surrounding natural resources and environment. Scientists working to conserve a resource are often distrusted by the local populace, and in turn, scientists and research managers are usually ignorant of the history, culture, and historical environmental knowledge that resides in local communities. Policy is often designed without sufficiently addressing the real-world considerations and, very importantly, the decision-making process of local citizens. At the same time, there is little interaction between scientists and other academic scholars carrying out social science and historical research in the very communities where the scientists and engineers are working. These dynamics are nowhere more evident than in post-Katrina New Orleans. Since Hurricane Katrina, there has been a great deal of public discussion of the quote-unquote feasibility of New Orleans' existence as a city that is situated largely below sea level, as I mentioned, on the banks of a highly changeable Mississippi Atchafalaya River system, a city whose very existence is the result of great human attempts to control the natural dynamics of the surrounding ecosystems. The scientific work of ecologists, geologists, and engineers has been variously invoked to support either side of a debate. Either one, the fault of the post-hurricane floods lies solely with the Army Corps of Engineers and the failure of the levee system, and therefore New Orleans can be rebuilt as it was before Katrina. Or, on the other hand, New Orleans must be radically altered in its planning, and communities, which mostly in many cases happen to be low-income communities of color, must be moved or altogether eliminated to avoid inundation with the next great storm. This debate has been pitted in the media and often by those engaged in it as a fundamental and irreconcilable disagreement between the environmental and the social. Much has been written about the importance of involving private citizens and local communities in policy decisions. Bray et al. In 2007 wrote that public discussion and inclusion of quote-unquote local factors are important in creating policy that is, as they said, socially acceptable. Local cultural norms, local history, and local attitudes affect the values private citizens have in the decisions they make. Adger in 2003 stated that the ability of a community to formulate policy depends on, quote, culture and place-specific characteristics that can be identified only through culture and place-specific research. These local, cultural, and place-specific considerations are often neglected when scientists, scholars of public policy, and policymakers, who very often do not live in the community where they are working, have no personal history there, and or have little contact with many sectors of the local population, carry out their work. Indeed, research has shown that policy tends to be more successful if it is developed by a collaborative group that includes, and I quote, a relatively balanced mix of governmental and non-governmental participants. Many scholars of public policy advocate a democratic process that involves, quote-unquote, ordinary citizens. The cultural history and social dynamics in New Orleans make these considerations all the more pressing. There are, and in my own house will, I think, unpack this a lot, there are cultural traditions that many say are found solely in the New Orleans region, and a relatively large proportion of people who have lived in New Orleans all their lives and whose families have lived in New Orleans for generations have attitudes and rationales for decision-making that are impossible to understand without knowledge of local cultural norms. For the outsider doing environmental research, social research, or policy work in New Orleans, interaction with local citizens is crucial to understanding these dynamics. Since Hurricane Katrina, the lack of this interaction is a major barrier to the development of successful policy in post-Katrina New Orleans. Again, I would argue that while New Orleans does have as a distinctive cultural history, all of these issues are universal in terms of what other coastal communities are facing today. There's active research being done on the effects of climate change on cultural heritage, especially in developing nations whose coastal communities are vastly more environmentally and economically vulnerable than New Orleans, countries such as Colombia, India, and Sri Lanka, just to name 3 out of dozens. Again, New Orleans has many lessons for us that are applicable globally. I think there's a useful analogy to be drawn between some of these issues faced in coastal cities like New Orleans in terms of the actual viability of the community itself in the face of climate change and natural disasters, and this might sound weird at first, in the history of the fishing industry, the management of fisheries resources and fishing communities. Fish, like the environmental location of a city, are a resource that is linked to human culture in a variety of ways. Fish are a source of economic livelihood for the individual people who make their living fishing, and are also economically important in terms of larger corporations and in the fishing industry. The presence and persistence of healthy fish stocks in a particular location makes it possible for a coastal fishing community to develop and grow over time. There are countless examples of this all over the world. Any community in Newfoundland, Canada, many communities in coastal Maine, the city of Gloucester, Massachusetts, and small communities in the South Pacific are just a few examples I have personal experience with. These are cities and communities that would not exist if not for the presence or past presence of a viable fishing industry, some have argued. Thus, the health of the fish resource is tied to the history and culture of a community. Scientists play a crucial role here. Scientists are charged with the task of studying the health of the fish population, understanding when the population is in trouble, and making recommendations about how to protect and conserve fish stocks when they are in trouble. My bachelor's degree is in marine fisheries biology and management, and I worked as a scientist for the National Marine Fisheries Service early in my career, working with scientists who were studying the health of fish stocks and also working in fishing communities in Newfoundland, Canada, Cape Cod, and Maine. Over and over again, I saw the same pattern. Scientists would discover a fish population was in great peril from overfishing. My agency would release a statement saying that the fish stock was in trouble. Recommendations would be made about halting fishing or severely curtailing fishing on a particular fish population. Then a vigorous public and political debate would ensue, wherein the fishing industry would often claim that either A, the science was faulty, and or B, the economic realities of the communities that depended on fishing made it impossible to halt fishing, and scientists were so detached from the realities of citizens' lives that they had no appreciation for this.